in spite of the many times during which we have shared with you the concept of the changes that your world is experiencing and that your species is undergoing as they begin to make choices in the growth of the species as a whole. It is a message that cannot be repeated too often because there are so many issues that come up in between each message that bring the question again, why is this happening, or what can we do to change it? And so it is important to recognize that there are patterns of lessons that will occur and that mirror the progress of the individual human being for an entire species, thus repetition. Ecological disaster, as you would call it, that is to say, perhaps the word disaster is improper. Ecological crisis will occur periodically at different levels of severity. And in each time it occurs, it awakens more and more people. It aggravates the entire world conception of their ability to participate in change, to either prevent or to allow additional occurrences to happen. Yes? And so there are progressions of events, and whether or not they are perceived as being worse than an event which preceded, and whether or not they in actuality have a longer term effect is not the biggest issue. What has to happen is that the perception of the severity of the event happens more rapidly. There is more of an international recognition that something has happened and an awareness that no one individual or nation can contain the situation by itself. And then, if because of the nature of that particular event or the circumstances surrounding it on your earthly plane cause the event to be less severe than anticipated, it does not negate its value in terms of the growth of the species. The perception may be, you see, it wasn't as bad as you thought, so you are all exaggerating. But that is not the point. The point is frequency at which these events are now taking place, and the frequency with which they are being shared with others due to the same technology that sometimes causes confusion and misunderstanding. It is rapid dissemination of information, rapid analysis and awareness of the problem, so there may be a more rapid and widespread reaction and response. So as it is on this worldly plane, it is the same in human experience. Constant repetition of actions and behaviors, almost accelerating as one moves towards greater and greater understanding and growth, so as to constantly create a pattern of more instantaneous recognition of what is happening, a more instantaneous response, and perhaps a broader response on the part of the individual or those who surround the individual. This is a constant process, and it is consistent with the theories and understandings of existence that have been shared with you and this unit, not only through this particular source, which is ourselves, our frequency of information, but through other sources that have, shall we say, reported from a similar frequency. So there is a consistency. Unfortunately, whenever beings are in the middle of situations, it is less easy to perceive the consistency. It seems as an overwhelming series of repetitions, as though nothing has changed and nothing has been done. However, there is always change. There is always change. Sometimes it is more easily perceived than at other times. But change is as consistent and constant a response to various experiences, even as they are repeated, as the experiences are themselves. there is simply no situation in all of existence where a seemingly repeated experience is identical to one that precedes it, nor is there any such event that does not cause a new response as opposed to simply a similar response. This is important. Remember this. There is no situation, regardless of how frequently it seems to be repeated, to which the response is always the same. Incident and response are constantly in change, because each event changes the event that will pass on after it. Also, it changes your perception of the events that precede it. So, follow, precede, the event changes. Yes? And so this is an important thing to remember, because all individuals go through their points in life where they are perceiving the repetitions. And the frustration is, at what point can you stop the repetition? And you may apply exercise after exercise and still discover that there seems to be repetition. It is difficult to learn some lessons, especially if the lessons you are learning would seem to be in conflict with certain other essential aspects of your being. They may not actually be in conflict, but in reality they will often seem that way. And for any human being who aspires to a degree of spiritual understanding, the ultimate conflict of understanding is between the physical existence and the rules which govern your physical being in a lifetime and the concept of the other levels of existence. Yes, those levels which are not perceivable, those levels which exist but which you essentially must believe in because of certain experiences, as opposed to the actual knowing. Four-footed creature has decided to emerge, but we will not worry ourselves. Little creature may make sounds. We will edit them out. Yes, Elizabeth?
Yep, that's fine.
One moment, we have an interesting solution. If we can engender it. It cannot be engendered. Little creature will have to survive. Thus, another example of a repetition, an effort to remove the quadruped that was unsuccessful. And then instead of pursuing that, the aspiration that it will cause no disruption. It is a repeated process, yes, but the things learned from it at each instant are somewhat different. Your planet is about to undergo so many experiences which are hopefully going to result in an enlightened understanding that spreads throughout the entire planet, even to those cultures who are less aware of such events. It cannot happen rapidly. It will take time. And in your lifetime, you may experience the frustration of seeing it for what it is and wanting to speed up the process and feeling the frustration that your own efforts have proven either meaningless or are relatively insignificant. But that is never the case. Remember the wisdoms that have been shared with you throughout millennia. You never know who is listening. You never know what being has been touched by your words, and you will never know which words you have spoken that have been the most effective. You will never know what seed you planted, and you may never know when it bears fruit, and yet it will still do so. For a seed that is planted that receives nourishment from whatever source will still grow, even if you are not there to tend it. That is the nature of existence. It is a false understanding that an individual must always be the one directly involved. There is a process that exists whether you participate in it or not. And that process is actually universal. And from the universal perspective, the perspective of that which is love without conditions, from that perspective, all those things which come after you have taken any given action are acceptable and allowable, even if they do not occur the way you would have preferred they would have occurred, because your judgment is conditional upon your experience and your wishes and what you perceive to be the best thing. Has it not been said time and time again that one's own individual perceptions of what is or is not right or good or beneficial can be completely erroneous? Of course, because your own perceptions are only based on what you perceive within your limitations. Therefore, actions which seem painful or negative or derogatory in a given moment can be those actions which cause a change at a later date that is wholly positive, and without which that event either would not have occurred or would occur at a far later date. You cannot be sure. It is the reason why certain gifts of power and mastery are not permitted except at certain levels. What is one of the primary lessons, which not only both of you know, but certainly which this unit has been reminded of several times in recent time periods, and yourself at least 3 times since we last communicated? It is not about knowing what you can do, but knowing when you may not do it. How much more difficult both of you have experienced is it to know when you may not take an action and you know you could? That is the difficult task. By the same token, there are times when you must take an action regardless of the perceived outcome because it had to be taken. If it were not, then other events which are dependent on it cannot have occurred. Because remember, in the reality of the universal experience, past, present, and future are simultaneous. Regardless of how many times one says that, or perhaps enjoys the thought in an entertainment vehicle, such as a novel, or one of your many films, or such things, it is a concept which is essentially incompatible with the human mind. Because human beings do not live simultaneously in the past, present, and future, except in imagination. In your physical reality, you do not think about that. It is a metaphysical construct that mathematicians may enjoy. But in practical terms, you know very well it is a concept you may think about, but can you really live in it? Very rarely, only at certain states of existence and only momentarily. So you cannot ever know. In the present, you may look back on the past, perceive and judge and see that what is being said at this moment has proven itself to be true. But that does not mean that you can, by extension, project into the future the inevitable truth that will occur. It is not really possible because, as you know, there are many possible futures and it is always changing. Having said that the future is in a perpetual state of change, does not alter the fact that an action taken in the present may have to be taken in order to engender other actions which will take place in the future. What you cannot determine is the when of it, or the why of it, or the way in which the actions you are taking will cause that event to occur or be a part of the event which is occurring. Is that too complicated, Elizabeth?
No, it's fine.
Excellent. And so, as you perceive international alterations on the physical structure of your planet, in society, in social interaction, in politics, and even in conflict. Be aware that every time something occurs that you thought had already happened, that you thought had already been addressed, there is something more that has to be experienced by the greater number of beings on the planet. It is why you are encouraged to strive for balance and composure. What does balance and composure mean? It is for you to be in a state where you can actually live with the calm of perceiving this as truth. Now, it is reasonable to say, but how can I do this when I'm also living in the world and experiencing the effects of these various events? It is one of the many challenges of the duality we have spoken of. What is the duality? The being in the physical world, the having to abide by physical rules, but at the same time recognizing that all of that is to a degree an illusion. Now, when that is said, let us be very clear. By illusion, it is not meant to say it is unreal. It exists. It is just not the product of the reality you think it is. That may be a little bit more difficult to understand or explain because it is a difficult concept to explain using what you would call regular three-dimensional language, yes? It is the world in which those who have devoted themselves to living at all times in a spiritual life come closer to understanding. It is the place from which their detachment springs, so that they can allow themselves to exist with various bodily difficulties, or allow themselves to function with seemingly no concern for the world or the individuals around them. In some cases, it is inappropriate and neglectful, but in many cases, it is a true and sincere expression of the clarity of the individual who is being in that way. It is where you would hope ideally to find yourself arriving one day in this lifetime. Yes, yes. So that both of you can have that balance and equanimity. But it is a long and difficult road or mountain to climb, if you will. And there is effort required. And there are pauses, many, many pauses. Yes? And yet, you do not leave the mountain. You do not go backwards the way you came, because you cannot. There is only one direction for those who have made the kinds of choices that you in this unit have made. And that one direction is ever one step in front of another, continuing on and on the journey you have chosen. It is important that both of you recognize that whatever you have gone through and experienced again and again and again is not indicative of any failure on your part or any lack of perception, but rather the continued importance of that particular experience for your learning process. It is true that each of you have been somewhat self-indulgent when it comes to certain disciplines. There is no question. That has already been discussed, and there is no need to bring out that particular peacock feather broom again. Yes? No, it has been sufficiently discussed, because each of you is intelligent enough to know what it is you can do, what you have done, what you are doing, and what you are capable of doing. So that has been discussed. But all other discussion aside, you are each of you continuing to make progress. It is simply a question of where is it you want to be by a certain time, and what level of effort must you put into it to arrive at that goal. So there is no failure option. because you cannot fail. You simply cannot. As long as you remain alive and in the body, as long as you remain conscious, as long as you continue to feel and respond and react, you are in a learning process. And that learning process will constantly bring you new wisdom. And it is ever present and ever continuous. And no, there is no point where it ends until you decide to decease the embodiment. And then it is simply reprocessed for another session.